Welcome to the Binzager Institute for Sustainable Prosperity Young Scholars Series. It's a new interview series where we'll be interviewing young up-and-coming scholars who are doing exciting research that we'd like to highlight. I'm very delighted that this week our first guest in the series is Professor Scott Ferguson from the University of South Florida. Professor Ferguson holds a PhD in Rhetoric and Film Studies from UC Berkeley. He is currently co-director of the Film and New Media Studies program in the Department of Humanities and Cultural Studies at the University of South Florida. He's also a research scholar with the Binzager Institute for Sustainable Prosperity, and I'd like to highlight his forthcoming book, Declarations of Dependence, Money, Aesthetics, and the Politics of Care. It'll be coming out soon from the University of Nebraska Press. Welcome to the Binzager Institute Young Scholars Series, Scott Ferguson.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you. We've had an exciting week here at UMKC. You've given a couple seminars as well as a public lecture. The feedback has been incredible. And you're co-founder of the new Modern Money Network Humanities Division. So I'd like to ask you, how do you define the humanities?
How do I define the humanities? That is a good question. So there are numerous ways of defining the humanities. One is really basic. It's predicated on the kinds of artifacts that we study. Right? So in the humanities, we tend to study objects of cultural production. We study film. We study various kinds of media. We study painting. We study literature, different types of literature. We study world languages. So that I think first and foremost is what humanities scholars do. I would also say that humanities scholars on the whole have a methodological commitment to a certain, let's say, ethos or an approach to our cultural artifacts that we're studying. And I guess what I would say is we typically want to honor the complexity of cultural artifacts, which includes their tensions and their contradictions, their pains and their pleasures, what maybe is going on at the manifest level of a painting or a song, and what might be going on maybe at a more unconscious level. And what might be going on at the level of the form of the work itself, that maybe, you know, the lyrics or the dialogue is not participating in. And then I would say that, you know, our job is to make hopefully compelling, insightful, and transformative arguments about the meaning of cultural objects. And again, I think affirming their ambiguities, right? Their contradictions, because the world is ambiguous and contradictory. So I guess that's the way I would define the humanities. And sometimes we bring this to areas that we're not normally associated with, right? So there's a whole area called science studies where we take on contemporary scientific practice, we take on the history of scientific practice, and we bring that sense of nuance and complexity to make meaning of these cultural processes, artifacts, but sort of from that perspective. Yeah. Right.
Thanks. And so I'm wondering, you've brought economics and political economy into your research, but how would you describe generally the kind of economics and political economy that scholars in the humanities tend to utilize or draw on?
That's a great question. I'm generalizing and maybe not being entirely fair. But in my training and my sense of the humanities, especially prior to coming to heterodox economics and MMT, I would say for the most part, critical humanities scholars typically rely on the rich and diverse Marxist tradition, both, I suppose, more focused political economy in the Marxist tradition, and the heterogeneous and often opposing traditions in, cultural and aesthetic Marxism, which is really the tradition that I come out of. So Marxism, and then, I think that there are various, let's say, more and less self-conscious influences of neoclassical economics, I think that a lot of humanities scholars read Paul Krugman in the New York Times and sort of imagine that that's sort of the best that we can do. So when I came into this world, it was news to me that there was something that's called heterodox economics, that it includes Marxism, that Keynes is not just Paul Krugman, that there's a long and rich and diverse and embattled tradition of figuring out what Keynes was about, what Keynes was saying, that there's the tradition of post-Keynesianism, that there is the tradition of institutionalism. And I think that humanities scholars could learn a lot by starting to pay attention to and engage with, and hopefully reciprocally, the heterodox tradition.
Yeah, there's a similar, I would say, phenomenon in even the social sciences outside of economics.
Oh, I imagine.
Absolutely, where it's either Marx, a kind of general institutional economics, or neoclassical economics. I'm a little surprised that there are scholars in the humanities utilizing neoclassical economics.
Well, but the question is, are they utilizing it, or are they just unconsciously reproducing its assumptions? And I think it's mostly usually the latter.
Absolutely. So I'm interested in how you became aware of modern money theory and what your initial reaction to modern money theory was.
So, as I said, I was trained in the Marxist cultural aesthetic tradition. Frequently we just call this critical theory in the humanities. And I was working on a project about media, popular media in the neoliberal age. I was focusing in particular on the Hollywood Blockbuster. I think like most people, they're constantly Googling their interests, right? So I would always search, critical theory, neoliberalism, blah, 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 blah. And you find articles or essays or podcasts. So I found a podcast series called From Alpha to Omega. And I listened to a few episodes, and I guess that might have been the place where I started to hear that word heterodox for the first time, heterodox economics. And then Randall Wray did an episode, and that's the one I heard first. And that was the first time, and my jaw dropped. And I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Because the Marxist tradition that I had been reared in told me that money was the problem, that money was necessarily an instrument of privation. And then if we wanted justice and if we wanted egalitarian participation and distribution, we had to deal with this terrible money thing. We had to, appropriate it, but ultimately we had to get rid of it. And what I heard Randall Ray saying was that, no, you can actually have what you want. I mean, you have to fight for it, but you can actually have what you want with this monetary instrument. It is an instrument of power, and you have to treat it as such. But there's nothing ontologically privational about it, right? And this just, it knocked me off my horse, and I had the moment, and then I had to figure out what was going on. So I had to learn, right? And I heard your interview on the same podcast, and I just started reading, and I started connecting with people who are also trying to figure it out. And I asked all the tough questions, and I asked about international trade, and I asked about capital flight, and what about this and what about that? And slowly but surely, both the answers that MMT provides, but also my own interpretations of some of those answers, I kind of became more comfortable. I was on board from the beginning,
right?
But I had to work out those problems, those little lingering skepticisms or confusion.
Absolutely.
And and then sort of as I was doing so, and I felt this from the beginning, but this wasn't just another point of view about money to me. It wasn't just another angle on political economy. I immediately, intuitively understood or felt that this unsettled a lot of what we take for granted, not just in terms of our economic relations, but in terms of our social relations, in terms of cultural production, in terms of causality, in terms of how we historiography, how we tell the history of the world, right? Because I had there's the I had all these ready-made narratives about how, in the 1970s we had stagflation and we found out that Keynesianism doesn't work, and then the monetarists and the neoliberals stepped in and they had the answer, and that's just sort of what happens, right? So to me, even the causes and effects of history and broader history and the history of my lifetime, I just felt like the ground was shifting beneath me, and I had to start figuring it out. So that's my origin story.
Right, really interesting. So, as we mentioned, you're a co-founder of the Humanities Division of the Modern Money Network, and I'm wondering what the response has been so far, and who or what some of the contributors are, and what kind of work they're starting to.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. So we are, I would say, an embryonic organization at this point. We don't even have a built-out web presence at this point. I think what we decided to do was that our first project was going to be a conference. And we thought we would come up with a somewhat provocative title for the conference, which is Money on the Left, which to many leftists is an oxymoron. I don't know, those things don't go together. So Money on the Left, Word, Image, Praxis. Right? And we were trying to be inclusive, and we've gotten a pretty good response. Originally, it was supposed to be a one-day conference, and we've extended it into a two-day conference. Nice. That's great. And what I would say is that this is the Humanities Division hosting an interdisciplinary conference.
Right.
They're not all humanities people.
Right.
We don't have enough of those yet. In part, this conference is designed to show the humanities world that there is humanities work to be done here.
Right.
Right. So we have scholars, we have students from frankly all over the world coming to talk. Some are talking, about familiar sort of MMT research projects about, politics and governance in the Eurozone, right, in relationship to the problem of sovereign money. But then we also have people taking on more humanities questions about the arts, about how they're funded, about how they might be funded, right? The way we might publicly fund the arts, right? Whether it's in local community institutions or it's through using our digital technology, right, to produce a kind of digital commons that would be publicly supported. I have I have a group of master's students at my university who have been learning about modern monetary theory and have their own interests. So I have students who are interested in video game aesthetics and contemporary television and animation aesthetics. I have students interested in mainstream feature films. One student is going to be presenting on Quentin Tarantino's *Inglourious Bastards*. So I think this is going to be a great inaugural conference for the Humanities Division, getting our feet wet, and hopefully, sharing with one another, but also sharing with the world what we can do, right? And I think also opening up a path to a whole lot more questions and research.
And the dates of the conference and location?
The dates of the conference are April 6th and 7th, so coming up at the University of South Florida. I should also say, there's some very exciting additions. Mathew Forstater is giving the keynote talk, right? Okay. And then we'll also be having a video conversation with a state representative from Hawaii who's a Democratic Socialist of America member, and he is currently running for Congress, and we're going to be asking him questions about, and he's openly an MMT supporter, and we're going to be asking him, what does MMT mean for the future of democratic socialist politics in America?
Absolutely exciting. I saw the program, and it really looks to be really path-breaking, in my view, an exciting conference.
Thanks. I hope so. I think so.
So I was mentioning your forthcoming book, Declarations of Dependence, and maybe you could talk a little bit about what you're trying to accomplish with this intervention.
Right. Okay. So I think first and foremost, I'm trying to start a critical and creative reciprocal dialogue between modern monetary theory, heterodox economics on the one hand, and critical humanities work. Right? So that's first and foremost. And I believe that the two have a lot to say to one another and can help one another. So that's the first thing. Second thing, and I think a little bit more particularly, as I mentioned, my training is in Marxist critical theory. Right? Marxist critical theory that's really focused on analyses and critiques of cultural production and aesthetics. Right? So what this book is arguing for is regrounding the project of critical theory in modern monetary theory's understanding of the money relationship. So historically, critical theory has been a Marxist project. And I still have Marx in my bones, and a lot of those impulses are still there. So I don't want to throw that out, but what I'd like to do is open up and redirect the project of critical theory through this alternative understanding of money, and I think more capacious and with much more potential for collective transformation. So that's the main project. Then there is a more specific argument that really structures the narrative arc of the book as a whole, and it comes in early, and then it sort of fades into the background, and then it kind of comes in at the end. And that argument is that the way that we in the modern West conceive of and practice art has been organized around this sort of category of thought and practice that is called the aesthetic. This arises in what we call bourgeois modernity with the long Enlightenment, across Scotland and France and Germany and Britain, of course, it's a heterogeneous project, but the way that modern scholars understand this is that the rising class of the bourgeoisie started, through their philosophers, through their thoughts, and through their practices, they started thinking that their political and economic life and interactions, while productive and worth pursuing, wasn't enough. And in fact, there was a lot of alienation and tensions and privation and conflicts in the political and economic sphere that needed some help, that needed some buttressing. So they started. Immanuel Kant, very famously, turned back to the Greeks and sort of revive this Greek term aesthesis, right? Which essentially just means sensation, right? And started to philosophize about a logic of sensation, a practice of sensation, and they started talking about what they increasingly called the aesthetic sphere. And the aesthetic sphere is where we cultivate our senses and we expand our senses and we develop them and we introduce heterogeneity into our sense of the world. We commune with one another. We commune with the natural world. So that was the aesthetic project. And eventually, as the bourgeois class increasingly became those who were the patrons of the arts, right? This whole idea of the aesthetic sphere became the larger sort of philosophical and cultural template for understanding modern art production. So originally the aesthetic was opposed to money, essentially. Money is nice, but it doesn't work all that well, so we'll have this aesthetic project on the side. And then what this starts is what is often referred to as a dialectic between political economy, sometimes it's just referred to as everyday life, and the aesthetic. So this dialectic starts, and then you have more leftists and more radicals and socialists who are saying, this isn't enough. We don't need an aesthetic thing on the side. We should make our whole lives like the aesthetic, right? Our whole lives, our political economy should feel like the aesthetic. It should be sensuous, a diverse cultivation of our sensory capacities. And then by the time you get to the 1960s and the 1970s, and especially into what we call the neoliberal era of the 1980s, this dialectic, this tension starts to look tired. It starts to look essentially like the socialists and the radicals have lost. And really, aesthetic theory for the last 30, 40 years, while heterogeneous, and you have your optimists and your pessimists, but I would say that as a whole, it's colored by a kind of malaise, because there's a sense that the aesthetic project wasn't able to live up to its potential. So what my argument is that modern monetary theory tells us that money is a boundless public utility, and that the bourgeoisie of the modern liberal period did not see that, and they treated money essentially as a kind of decentralized finite exchange instrument, and that arguably that's the reason why things were not up to snuff or full and replete the way they wished they would be. It's that reason that then the aesthetic project arises as a kind of supplement, and I would argue a symptom of this liberal understanding of money, which is an impoverished one. Then my argument is that when we look at various socialists and radicals in the dialectical conflict, and they have the right impulse, and they want to say, no, we should, our political economy should be this way. I still think that they're caught up in the logic of the what I call the liberal money form, rather than questioning that foundation in the first place. And so the malaise today is historically conditioned by an impoverished conception of money, and I'm arguing that this whole dialectic needs to be rethought, right? And of course, we can have a publicly funded aesthetic production. We can have a lot of it, and we can have it. We can have that sensory diversity and cultivation, and we can have it through the monetary relation and by politicizing that monetary relation. So the long arc of the book is to make an intervention in the way that really modern thought, both orthodox and critical, have engaged this question of the aesthetic, and I'm really trying to rethink and reorient what the aesthetic has been and make possible what it could be if we embrace an MT's perspective on money. So that's the long arc.
Okay.
Yeah. Do you want me to talk about?
Looking forward to it.
Do you want me to? Do we have time? Should I keep talking about other parts of the book? Because that took a while.
I think is it 3? Yeah, we have time.
We have time. Just go.
We talk about the Blockbuster, or?
Yeah. Well, there's other parts.
Well.
Yeah. Okay. So, the second more specific move that I make in the book is to trouble the way that political philosophy has posed the question of the polis, right? The organization of the polis, both political philosophy and modern political theory. And on my reading, modern political philosophy, starting with at least Machiavelli, tends to pose the problem of politics in terms of power, principally in terms of power. How to get it, how to maintain it, how to organize it, how to distribute it. And what that does is it subordinates a question that I think is equally important for politics, which is the problem of care, the problem of the cultivation of what I call our inescapable interdependence upon one another. I also happen to think that the reason why this reduction of politics to power occurs is because it occurs along with the same history in which money is increasingly being understood as a private finite relationship, which, whether it is admitted or not, is understood to not be able to care for everyone who uses it. Right. So I'm a long student of political philosophy and political theory, and when I started reading modern monetary theory, I started to think, well, what is modern monetary theory? What is it really asking us to do? It's asking us to pose the problem of care, of collective caretaking, of the collective organization of our interdependence overtly and in a new way, and to say that we can pose this question, and that there are genuine answers to this question because we can always afford it. So that's chapter 2, and that's really where I get the title for my book, Declarations of Dependence, right? So I'm all for individual freedom. I'm all for variety, and people should be allowed to pursue what they want to pursue. But I think that modern political philosophy, and quite frankly, American contemporary culture, we're up to here in freedom, but we don't really talk about care nearly as much. And when we do, we talk about what ladies do, right? Or what unpaid minorities do, right? We don't talk about the political economic conditions of possibility that organize all that interdependence and caretaking in the first place. So that's where the title of my book comes from, Declarations of Dependence. Then in chapter 3, I take this step backwards, and I'm really trying to rethink the history of modern money, right? And we know in the MMT world, when we say modern money, we go to Keynes, and he says modern money has always been modern, or money has been modern for the last 4,000 years, or something like this, right? But I mean, even more specifically, I'm trying to tell a new story of the rise of modern money in modern Western Europe, right? It's a Eurocentric story. It's one that needs to be complemented by multiple other stories and problematized. But I am taking on this kind of canonical story and telling it in a new way. Christine Dazan at Harvard has done incredible work rethinking the legal construction of modern money in 17th century England.
Surely.
And this is it's a magnificent work. It's so filled with incredible arguments and evidence. And she sees this moment in which what we call this liberal private money form is actually argued for, and there is a conflict, and the result of that conflict is a new legal architecture which essentially seems to naturalize this notion that money is this private exchange relationship, right? The story that I am telling is that I'm trying to think about the philosophical, the metaphysical, even theological foundations that even make that kind of thinking or monetary imagination possible. And I trace this back to the transition between the High Middle Ages of about 1000 to 1300 to early modernity, and most scholars will place the origins of our early modern world in Renaissance Florence, essentially. 14th, 15th, 16th centuries. Right? And then the Florentine influence spreads, and the rest is history. So in chapter 3, I'm uncovering, with the help of many scholars who have done this work before me, but I'm bringing their stories together in a new way.
Surely.
That there was something like an MMT in the High Middle Ages. There were jurists, right? There were legal theorists and scholars, what we would call them today, who insisted upon the boundless inalienability of what they called the fisc, right? The fiscal instrument, the treasury, right? Essentially, it meant the sovereign sovereign holdings and sovereign property and sovereign spending capacity as well. So there was a moment when you know, Western Europe was chartalist, right, and overtly so. And what I explore is some of the philosophy and the theology that supported that moment, mostly or sort of quintessentially represented by Thomas Aquinas, the philosopher Thomas Aquinas.
Sure.
And in my book, I discuss the ways that his sense of the Christian cosmos is, in a certain way, a chartalist theology, right? And he kind of sees the way that the human society is organized and the way the cosmos is organized as being very much in line with some of the kinds of relationships that we imagine from a chartalist perspective. Then I trace the ways in which this chartalist understanding of the world is challenged, and challenged from two primary sources. And one is the Franciscan friars. They have a very different understanding of the structure of the world and are arguing with Aquinas, both during Aquinas' time and after. And then the other group that challenge Aquinas and this whole worldview are the Florentine humanists.
Right.
And both in their own ways, they did not like one another, these two groups. But my argument is that they essentially agreed because both of them in their own ways insisted that reality, it really ultimately turns around immediate, finite, sensuous interactions. Now, they both had a sense that God was still this infinite possibility, but for them, God was decentered from essentially the political and economic and religious infrastructures that actually mediated their world. And so on my reading and in my genealogy, this shift in philosophy, in theology, in ideas about the way reality is structured, prepared the groundwork for what we then see as the emergence of what eventually we call the liberal money form. But really that liberal money form is a Franciscan and a Florentine money form. So I'm trying to suggest that there was a time in which the European Western world, at least, could imagine something like MMT. And it was actually part of their cultural rituals, in addition to their understanding of their economic relationships. And so it's a story of recovery, of there's this possibility. And, I'd be interested in other histories about other traditions around the world which might also open this up in ways that maybe the Western story might be limited, right? And it's a new story about causality. So if Christine Dazan is arguing that really modern liberal money comes from 17th century legal battles in England, my argument is yes, good, but I actually think that the broader structural, political, philosophical, even theological conditions were already being transformed years before that. So that's my third chapter. And then my fourth chapter, remember, I'm a professor of visual studies and film and media studies. I come back to questions of modern visual culture in my last chapter. And my argument there is that at the same time that we see the Florentine humanists affirming the reality of only finite sensuous interactions, and really affirming a form of money that's only finite exchange relationships, we also see the rise of something that most people are familiar with, which is Florentine Renaissance perspective. Now, most scholars and art historians tend to think about this history in terms of the advent of geometrical perspective, 1.2, 3-point perspective. Sometimes they tie this to the sort of the calculating, money-oriented nature of the Florentine mind, interested in abstraction. Other scholars tend to focus on the naturalism of Florentine perspective. And my argument about Florentine perspective is that it is neither natural nor actually properly abstract. Because my understanding of abstraction is that it describes usually a mode of social marking or signification that organizes relationships at a distance. And what the Florentine perspectival painting introduces, as opposed to the Byzantine and Gothic forms of representation, which were ecstatically abstract, is a finite, sensuous, contiguous, right? A world that is made up of things that touch, forces that touch. And so my argument is that at the very same time that you see a philosophical, theological, political and economic repression of money's abstract potential, you see this going on in the visual sphere as well. Not necessarily overtly about money, although the donors who paid for the paintings are often in the paintings, right? So money's always there, right? But what I'm more interested in is the organization of the sensorium that comes along with the Florentine moment as they are ambivalently wrestling with this finite exchange relationship, which they are helping to create as such. Cut to the present moment. So this Florentine perspective, which is really oriented around physical immersion and ultimately something that we will, by the time we get to the 17th, 18th century, we'll start to call gravity. It takes root in modern visual culture, and you can trace, it becomes contorted and even more contingent in the Baroque period when you look to the Netherlands, Flanders, and those kinds of delicate paintings. That's a different kind of commitment to and working out of this deeply immersive, material, contiguous visual field. Well, with the rise of what we call modernist art and modernist visual art, we see a repudiation of that and really an emphatic embrace of abstraction.
Right.
And my argument is that this embrace of abstraction reigns until about the mid to late 1970s. And instead of thinking about the history of painting, I'm more interested in tracking how the physicalist, materialist, contiguous impulse is reborn, and reborn with intensity in the new Hollywood blockbuster. And the new Hollywood blockbuster it's known as opposed to the Hollywood Dream Factory, which was the metaphor we used to describe classical Hollywood cinema. We started calling the Hollywood blockbuster, largely because of their action sequences, thrill rides. Right? And it wasn't just that they were action films. We've had action films since cinema began. We loved watching people leaping from bridges onto moving trains and saving the day. And the difference is that the whole formal organization of cinematic experience changes along with this action cinema, and it becomes a deeply immersive cinema. Everything becomes organized around producing sensations of immediate tactility and constant simulations of gravity. And not that there wasn't gravity, I mean, people weren't floating around in
Sure.
classical Hollywood cinema, but that wasn't a priority for classical Hollywood cinema. With the new Hollywood blockbuster, the narratives are oriented around getting us into situations where we're going to be feeling gravity. We're going to feel its pull. We're going to feel its impact on landing. We have a new commitment to bass-driven surround sound. So it's not just that we're seeing and being visually immersed, we're sonically being immersed as well.
Surely.
And so I connect this to the rise of what we call neoliberalism, right? Where some of the gains and compromises of various working class struggles and labor struggles from the late 19th to the early 20th century sort of to a certain degree paid off, right? and there was fairly wide white patriarchal middle class prosperity,
Right.
For a lot of people. A lot of people were left out, right?
Surely.
Certainly was not a
Surely.
utopia. But in the neoliberal moment, as most of us know, these gains were under attack and have been increasingly dismantled over the last 40 years. And I make the connection that the new Hollywood blockbuster and its immersive physicalist, gravitational aesthetics coincides with the rise of neoliberalism. And I'm concerned about this form of organizing sensuous experience for us today because I think that they repress the problem of abstraction at the level of our sensory experience. And I think our only hope is to embrace abstraction and ultimately the key abstraction that organizes our lives, which is monetary abstraction.
Right.
Money is not a thing, it's a social relation, as Marx said.
Absolutely.
And it's an abstract relation. So that's the book as a whole.
Well, I appreciate you for indulging me.
Yeah, sure.
And I thank you so much for spending this time with us and for being so generous with your time. I congratulate you on the work that you're doing.
Thank you.
And I wish you all good things from now and the future.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.